Hi, this is a video recording for discussion 2 on IEPs and 504s. The first step in the eligibility process for referring students for classroom accommodations under a 504 plan or special education services under an IEP is to start with the pre-referral process. The term pre-referral process in education, according to the IRIS Center, refers to a preventative measure that can help to eliminate inappropriate referrals to special education. The pre-referral process exists to establish, address, and define the necessary process for discovering, assessing, and referring students who may benefit from special education resources. This process involves detailed stages to ensure an appropriate referral can be made and is designed to avoid some of the issues associated with referral processes. The pre-referral process is more than a process for identifying and assessing students with special needs. It is also an opportunity for educators to learn and understand the needs of their students and to implement educational strategies for their students that can better equip them to learn regardless of the outcome of the pre-referral assessments. To do this, educators employ consultative, collaborative, and linear approaches to establish the educational process for their students. Educators consult various individuals of expertise, collaborate with parents and other educators, and follow a step-by-step approach in the pre-referral process. There are six stages in the process: an initial concern, where an educator or a care provider initiates the process by expressing concern for a child, which could be due to various reasons like failing grades, trouble concentrating, trouble with comprehension, poor behavior. The second step is to gather information. An educator or a counselor or a team of professionals gathers information on a student's educational background, including the student's background experiences, skill level, classroom instruction, and behavioral management strategies that have been used, and classroom and home expectations. The next step is to share information and to discuss that information with a team. And in this stage, a team that is composed of educators, counselors, intervention specialists, and or parents and caregivers is gathered to discuss the relevant data collected on the student and ideas and interventions, including type and intensity that may help the student. The next step is a discussion of possible strategies. Starting with the student's strengths, the support team focuses on possible instructional and behavioral strategies to implement for the student, including classroom environmental management, instructional methods, and accommodations or modifications for the student regarding coursework. And then the next step is to implement and monitor these strategies to see if they work in the classroom over a period of time, to determine if those simple modifications and accommodations are sufficient to help the student with their educational and behavioral improvement. And if not, they will go on to an evaluation and to decision making. In this stage, it's where the team reconvenes to discuss the outcome of the strategies and to determine if the strategies worked and they no longer need to continue the process, or if they didn't work and they need to refer the child for a formal special education referral. Once the pre-referral process is complete and it is determined that a student needs a formal special education referral, an IEP, or if they need a 504, a meeting is planned. Whether or not the student needs an IEP or 504 is determined based on a list of criteria. Usually a student who does not qualify for an IEP but does have a disability that affects one or more of her or his life functions and requires some classroom accommodations and rarely some modifications can qualify for a 504 instead. Some of the differences between an IEP and a 504. An IEP is a special education plan, whereas a 504 is a plan of support for students with disabilities. The IEP was established under IDEA. The 504 is actually the 504 section under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. An IEP creates an individualized special education plan for a student, whereas a 504 is a plan of accommodations and modifications for the student in the classroom environment. To qualify for the IEP, a student must have one or more of the 13 disabilities listed under IDEA that disrupts the child's ability to learn and requires special education services to make progress in school. To qualify for a 504, student can have any disability that interferes with their inability to learn in a general education classroom. The IEP team must include the child's caregiver, general education teacher, special education teacher, school psychologist, and special education district representative. The 504 team can include, but doesn't necessarily have to, the child's caregiver, the general education teacher, special education teacher, school principal sometimes, school counselor sometimes. For the IEP, a written document has to be done that establishes learning goals and describes services the school will provide to the student, including accommodations, modifications, or interventions. It describes the services in details and is very specific. For a 504, there is no standard, and it doesn't actually have to be a written document. However, it usually is, and it usually establishes what accommodations and supports the student will be receiving. From my personal experience, I currently teach in a special education classroom. I've been there for this entire semester. I started as a long-term sub. I'm now there on a STIP, hoping to be there on an intern this fall. I teach reading fluency and study skills. My experience this semester has been in learning how to read, interpret, and implement IEPs in my classroom. I have had the opportunity to get to know my students through the relationships I've developed with them, coupled with the information that I have read and studied in their IEPs. I've had the opportunity to learn what it means to adjust my classroom environment to meet the accommodation needs of my students, including I have adjusted the lighting, I've assigned preferential seating, I have reduced noise in many instances. I decorated my classroom in a way that looks and feels structured and organized and is free of confusion. I've had the opportunity to learn what it means to implement modifications in my students' IEPs by learning how to chunk and scaffold lessons when my students need class breaks, when certain students need individual breaks, when my class or individual students need a change of environment. Sometimes we need to go for a walk, sometimes we need to read outside. I have learned how to practice using UDL, the Universal Design for Learning, in my classroom to meet a lot of the accommodations that many of my students need. So we use a variety of tools and methods to complete assignments, and I use a variety of tools and methods to teach my lessons. So some of my students use speech to text. All of them are allowed to use any of these accommodations under the UDL. It's recommended that you provide all of these accommodations to all of the students, and I have found that it's really helpful to do that. It doesn't single any students out, and it makes them all feel like they have choices. So speech to text is one that some of my students use. Some of my students need to answer questions orally and have a partner do the writing, or have me do the writing, or not do the writing at all if it isn't necessary. They have the option to write by hand or type assignments. They have been able to create multimedia presentations. They can turn them in or present them depending on what they're most comfortable doing. We've done silent reading as well as reading aloud. Sometimes they read aloud, sometimes I read aloud, sometimes we listen through YouTube or audiobooks to somebody else reading aloud. I've had the opportunity to modify both lessons I teach and assignments for various students to meet their needs, including giving extra time to complete assignments and tests, chunking assignments and reducing the amount of work, and simplifying assignments through step-by-step instructions and scaffolding. I've learned a lot from being able to read the needs of my students and their IEPs, and just from getting to know my students and trying different things to see what works, and implementing the accommodations and modifications in my classroom, since it is a special education classroom. A good majority of the accommodations and modifications that my students need, almost all of them need a lot of the same ones. So for me, using the UDL model and just making those accommodations and mostly accommodations available for all of them is very helpful. It's not always been easy, but I'm learning as I go. Thankfully, my students have been very patient with me, and we have been able to work together to have a very successful semester.